And so let me introduce Juan José Maraña. He has studied philosophy, and professionally he has worked with people with functional diversity. He has been an author and a publisher with different publications, and he's been working with the independent living movement since the 1990s. In 2001, he promoted the first and only forum on independent living. And he's participated in various national and international congresses, particularly focusing on issues that were discussed in Tenerife. I'm not sure the details of what he did there, but I must say that during that Congress, we brought together 400 people from 15 European nations. Beginning in 2004, Juan José has collaborated on initiatives to promote access to personal assistance. And our speaker is a member of the board of the Spanish Federation Independent Living and the Galician Foundation for Independent Living. So, Juanjo, I'd like to give you the floor. Good morning. And since this is a European Congress, I would like to explain to our foreign guests and colleagues that the country I come from, Galicia, is a beautiful area that's green and rainy in the northwest of Spain. Several years ago, an author from there said about the area. There we had 2.8 million humans, 1 million cows, 500 wolves, and one bear that nobody could find, and 500 million trees. And so, and I don't think today anyone has ever seen that bear. And now, if we were being observed from outer space, I think that he would agree with me that the people with functional diversity, now we have something of that very sweet look of the cows of Galicia. So, no, but as when we were visited by Antonio Centeno, an activist who's here today to talk about the revolution through sex, and he didn't exactly understand the beauty I was talking about. He said that when you look at a cow, and he didn't want to be like a cow. He didn't want to be confined like a cow in those farms where many men and women spend their lives in institutions. And so I would have liked to have been able to say to him that, yes, people with functional diversity, we do look a bit like cows or feel a bit like cows. We have a lot in common. The international scientific community, when it's done field work, is surprised to see that, for example, livestock faces north when it's chewing its cud, and that must have to do with the fact that the cows, that those cows with their beautiful eyes, their beautiful moist eyes, are looking north because of the magnetic pole. Historically, we've known that cows have done that, and they always look at the northern horizon, but nobody knew why. And so historically, there was livestock, and they always knew where the livestock would be. And this is something similar to people with functional diversity. And so, since we have a virtual awareness of the cows. Now, if we saw something on the horizon, then we didn't want to be put in those farms for human beings, and we were looking towards our North Star where we saw an independent living, and then we wanted to move towards that reality. Today, this hypothesis can be applied to us as human beings. People have to understand we are sensitive to the magnetic pole of freedom. And after 15 years of initiating this political adventure to bring about social change, if we look at the horizon of independent living, then we understand that the figure of the assistant, the personal assistant, is important, but we need to change laws. We need to defend ourselves in the environment in which we live. We've tasted some of that fresh grass, the fresh grass of freedom, but however, society keeps seeing us and they keep segregating us in our historical spaces. And so initially, 15 years ago, we were perhaps a little bit naive to believe that the state would understand how good it would be for a social minority to be given civil rights and human rights to exercise. However, that hasn't taken place. Now, we propose changes in obsolete instruments that would guarantee our personal autonomy with a basic salary for all, access to information, equality in the labor market, respect for help amongst peers compared to paternalism, and support for our systems that would make it possible for us to live independently. For example, the figure of the personal assistant. The umbrella law then was put together that was things that was developed to face the aging of the population. However, it doesn't take into account functional diversity in current legislation. However, the UN's Convention on the Rights of People with Disability says, although it says that we're entitled to independent life, this is something that we're very far from achieving. And functional diversity continues to be a limitation to our emancipation. So I believe that we need to rejuvenate all of our institutions. And we believe, at the time 15 years ago, thought that we would find support in those organizations in the field of disability. But we were mistaken to a large extent. And we've all undergone a personal and collective wear and tear over all of this time. And we're trying to break free of what's oppressive and what's acting as a straitjacket. And of course, we still believe in nothing about us without us. Independently of what political party is in power, then we see that nothing has changed, and that there are those big organizations which supposedly represent people with disability. But I think that we need to put new sap in our social tree, because these organizations continue with their toxic discourse, and they don't support the values of citizens, and they attribute, or they say that we have to overcome our own problems, become competitive, and that's the way that we'll be able to exercise our civil rights. And the neoliberal spirit then has fabricated a laboratory type of solidarity. And so, in other words, all they're doing is supporting their own initiatives as NGOs. Now, if we had to look at a puzzle of civil rights, the photograph of the pieces then would, for independent living, and would be the same as the traditional values. However, the pieces of the puzzle would look completely different. So if we compare ourselves with traditional NGOs and we see the way that we meet our collective needs, then we see that we're not pulling in the same direction. And so what we're talking about, again, that people are negotiating things about us but without us. And this is the way the state is working here in Spain. The National Association for the Blind or the representatives of people with disability are participating in all of these efforts without taking into account our reality, and they're self-perpetuating organizations, and they're not promoting independent living as we understand it. Now, given their weight and the fact that they're just trying to survive, then they dominate the media here, and they are and in fact, they claim to be the only organizations which can solve the Sudoku of functional diversity. However, we know the kind of support that we know. So remember that ad where they said either you can train these people with disability or you can buy the lottery from the National Association of the Blind. And so this is like a matrix where we have been cornered by this financial elite, and we've been made to swallow that bitter pill. So this is the dilemma of disability. This is like a complex equation where the state has to account for all of the duties that it hasn't performed. But what are we really talking about? We're talking about my perception of disability, and the traditional organizations then have said that their model is the only one, and they don't want to invest in reality. But we're talking about something as old as the world itself. We're talking about flows of power that are colliding amongst themselves. So I'm talking about the fact that the traditional organizations are excluding people, lots of people with functional diversity, and their cases are that lead to real despair where people can really not live in the conditions that they're relegated to. And all political actions, all alternatives then are simply cutting off at the root any change that would be possible. Now, social activism doesn't pay salaries, and the traditional organizations in Spain then are not going to accept any critical interpretation of reality that doesn't support their own industries and their own self-perpetuation. I'm talking about how in the last few years it seems that we have seen a renewal of our discourse. But we've seen this has been led by the Convention of the United Nations. We've seen that people with functional diversity then haven't really been able to change anything really in these organizations. And we haven't been able, and so we've seen that people are just trying to appear renovated in the eyes of the press. But we see that we still have a whole series of networks of institutions, and we see all of these interconnections of interests, and we see that all of these services are being provided for people with functional diversity. However, they don't believe in providing assistance based on the real needs of the users. They take into account our uniqueness. And we aren't participating in those areas where these people have been strong. So in other words, they keep talking about unemployment and structural poverty, etc., but they're nonetheless maintaining the status quo. So now working in the state, of course, is co-responsible for those policies that are going to condition the quality of life of people with functional diversity for years. I'm talking about the political situation and the economic crisis, where we don't see any organizations that are reflecting the apocalypse of the cuts in aid to our sector. And we're seeing how money is going to the banking sector. And we see see, and this should also be taken into account, NGOs that embrace the space of the business world as a way to manage their own activities, requiring constructive professionalism. But once again, they're building on the concepts of the past. And the financial system not only has taken hold of the state, but it's also taken over the NGOs, and so the care is given, of course, in function of how much money can be made. So things that are basic for life can't be considered in these terms. And so if we are going to face the demographic challenges of a country that's going to very soon have more than 8 million people who are older than 64 years of age, and of course 10% of the population has some kind of disability, we've got those millions of people who have been educated in individualism, competitiveness, conformity in every area of their lives. In every area of their lives, I was saying, and where production is the only thing that's worth striving for. And so we're going to have we're looking for a kind of epiphany whereby they're going to be looking out for the needs of other people. And so even with the enthusiasm for the quote-unquote third sector, it's going to be the service providers who are going to establish the model. And these services will only be available for a wealthy population. And so once again, we see how there is a leitmotif in all of these issues. And this leitmotif then is dragging us behind. And so the days of wine and roses then are not going to take into account human diversity unless it's going to be seen in business terms. And so in other words, we are being left behind as part of a volatile economy, and we get very little support, and we just get the crumbs of economic bonanza. And I think the independent life movement is at a crossroads. In other words, then it's like we're on a pilgrimage, as we see in Galicia, where I'm from. And we see that the state NGOs then who, and if we look at the inversion of the population pyramid, we're going to see that all of us are going to be looking for new horizons. More and more people who study the situation say that we'll only have a real change if we have the concatenation of a crisis, the energy crisis, the robot crisis. And so we have a forecast of a complete collapse in a country like ours, which it doesn't really understand what being a welfare state is all about, as other countries in our environment do. And this affects our expectations of equality in our community. That's why people with functional diversity can't wait for the world to regenerate its burned out roots, and will suddenly become considered citizens, even though we're different. The seeds themselves have gone bad. And just as the cows in my country then can't stop munching on the grass because that's what they live off of. So we're talking about ethical and biological changes. And we've seen that the situation has become sour and infirm at this point. And we can't keep using our traditional tools for mobilization. We have to raise consciousness on a personal and collective level so that we can bring about social justice. But we can't wait for others to do this. So we were going to have to perhaps accept this flat world that we're familiar with the limits and the horizons that are fixed for us. But times have changed, and those days are over. Now, we have a new narrative which has gone beyond all the possible studies on our exclusion and oppression. And so we've got all this scientific literature that would make many generations feel ashamed. We have a whole bunch of laws and norms which are never being upheld by our states, and it's been going on for dozens and dozens of years. So this looks like the end of a cycle. So if we talk about this in these terms, we've discovered there aren't any horizons. And those who can push us in any direction that we're not interested in going in, and they propose solutions, and they rip us open, and they study us as a problem in the system, not a problem of the system. If our oppression is based on all these things which are useless to us, then with a good doses of recklessness, and because we're extremely tired, we can say that the challenge is to change the system itself, not to recover it, and not to go back to it in any of its conditions before the crisis. And so it seems unbelievable that we still see scenarios when we have to review our situation once again, even decide on what side of the river we find ourselves. We don't want to be like dry leaves which are simply spinning on the surface of wild capitalism. We need to become the active players of a new cultural alliances, and the citizens need to draw together, and we need to follow the lines of feminism, and the welfare and living well needs to be understood in new terms, and the feminist economic culture has a conceptual revision of the capitalistic system, and that can be adopted by people with functional diversity as a society as a whole. And this has to do with services of caregiving. The patriarchal, the androcentric culture has erected barriers around people with functional diversity, and women as well. And women then have been relegated to the task of taking care of people with functional diversity. However, these are things that you'll never see in the graphs that reflect the economics of the system. And on the basis of feminist economic culture, we can start to look beyond the tip of the iceberg and implement alternative practices to be able to implement models that are based on people and the means. So even caregiving tasks can become considered things that are necessary for life. We'll have to relook at minimum salaries and maximum salaries and apply these things to people with functional diversity so that we can go to new scales of fiscal progressiveness, to find a self-reproductive economy to stimulate our shift to community-based life and reduce institutionalization, to reconfigure our territory and our cities as environments adapted to life and not to production, to decrease globalization of the shift of all of these tasks to immigrant women. Now, in this future, I think we need to use trial and error to come up with new spaces. Self-management groups will be necessary. We'll need to share housing, for example. We'll have to have time banks. We'll have to learn new things. We'll have to look in our own experiences so that we can establish our own independent life offices and develop models that will produce citizens who are empowered. We're trying to build horizons, to create a social base that will demand public models in this period of transition that will uphold our civil rights and that will break down barriers. And we'll have to see whether we want to be considered proud or mere consumers.